The collapse of South Africa's infrastructure has been systemic, it has been taking place for some time, and it affects every aspect of life of South Africans. The best metaphor I can give you is that of a new car. When you buy a new car, it is in perfect mechanical condition and it works the way it's intended to. But if you keep driving that car and it hasn't been serviced, increasingly you will start to have problems with its mechanical functioning until eventually the cost of repairing that car is greater than the cost of replacing it. That metaphor describes what has happened to South African infrastructure succinctly. It's also very clear that infrastructure repair and maintenance and renewal has been a low priority for ANC government at a national, provincial and local level, and very clearly it's been determined that this is not a focus in terms of their returns in elections. However, if you look across South Africa, I would venture that infrastructure collapse and the consequent impact on basic service delivery is probably increasing to be one of the most important issues that is affecting the daily reality of South Africans. If you look at our water infrastructure, the 10-year delay behind the Lesotho Highlands water project is now impacting our national security as a country. The capacity of our bulk pipes have not been increased to deal with population growth, and is being responded to by increased pressure being put through old pipes, and the consequences of that are severe losses. Our municipalities and their pipe networks have become the proverbial leaking buckets, with losses between 45 and 55% of all water. And this problem is compounded by the failure to deal with sewage, and that has caused over 40% of our groundwater in South Africa to become contaminated. The disaster in sanitation probably stands above all else, with the latest Green Drop report suggesting that 39% of wastewater treatment plants are completely dysfunctional, and that's up from the 29% just 9 years before. This has been compounded by load shedding as pumps are unable to pump the sewage out of the pump stations, the failure to expand capacity to deal with the increasing population sizes, and of course the impact of this is fundamental upon communities, their dignity, their health, their environment and their economy. And the examples of this abound across our country, in East London, eThekwini, in Welkom, in so many places where sewage has become a part of the lived reality of South Africans, and it's inexcusable. The road network across our country has been eye-watering. I have conducted tours of the provincial roads in many provinces in this country, and the impact of the decline in our road network is astonishing. I think perhaps the greatest condemnation, however, is that 30 years into our democracy, 79% of our road network is gravel. 30 years into our democracy. That can't be acceptable by any measure. And we can't even refer to any sets of data about the condition of our provincial roads, because there's no central repository where this information is kept in South Africa, and rather is the prerogative of 9 provinces that do this to varying degrees. But the reality of our road network is clear for South Africans to witness every single day. It has been impacted by the collapse of rail networks that has caused heavy vehicles to damage our provincial roads, a lack of maintenance and repairs, poor workmanship from a tenderpreneur system that has failed South Africans. And what it means is that most of our provincial road network has degraded to the point where it can no longer just be resurfaced. It has to be reconstructed down to the base layer of the road itself. Our rail network has become the fiefdoms of the delinquents of national government in the names of PRASA and Transnet. The Transnet freight rail network is transporting only 173 million tonnes of freight each year, down from the 219 million tonnes it was moving in 2017. And these numbers continue to decline as the rail network becomes increasingly unreliable. Export coal has moved down from 73 million tonnes to 58 million tonnes. And of course, we see that on our road networks every single day. And only 13% of the containers that are coming into the port of Durban are being moved on rail via the container corridor, with the remaining 87% being moved on our road network. The cost of all of this is estimated at 353 billion rand, or 5% of our GDP. The problems with Eskom is well known to South Africans, and South Africans don't need us to tell you about the realities of how Eskom has let us down. But the reality there is that Eskom is only producing marginally more power in 2024 than it was in 1995. And that is despite the fact that the population of our country has grown by 50% in that time. The real factor, though, is the declining grid availability. That is the measure of how much of that grid is online at any one point in time to supply the South African people. And in 2016, that figure sat at around 88%. And that figure has now gone down to as low as 64%. These have been the major drivers behind load shedding, and I think South Africans are entirely correct to be circumspect about the claims that Eskom is going to bring load shedding to an end as we approach an election, and ask themselves the question, why is Eskom, the Minister of Energy and the President, appealing a judgment from a high court that ActionSA secured that requires them to provide uninterrupted electricity to schools, police stations and hospitals, if indeed they are bringing load shedding to an end? But all of this aside, the lived reality of South Africans is that infrastructure collapse is impacting their day-to-day reality, and it is impacting the provision of basic services in the most profound manner. And I think one of the most startling things right now is the silence of political parties on this issue in this campaign. When you have communities that are living in sewage and roads that are breaking their vehicles, and the cost of everything increasing because of the collapse of our rail network, and the unavailability of water. These are issues that affect every South African, and yet nobody is talking about this issue. But this is why ActionSA has come forward to say we need to present an infrastructure master plan, a blueprint for how we're going to get the infrastructure of South Africa working and deliver the world-class infrastructure that South Africans deserve. The first step in our infrastructure master plan is the immediate reprioritization of the South African budget. We believe that this must begin with zero-based budgeting, and effectively every department begins with nothing until they make the case for how their budgets are going to serve the strategic interests of our country. A key part of this is redirecting the funds from the waste. We saw when Herman Mashaba was the mayor of Johannesburg, 2 billion rand was immediately redirected from international travel, from self-promoting marketing, from conferences, from catering, all the luxuries and perks and wastages of national government. And you can imagine when you multiply that across all of the municipalities and 9 provinces and national government, how much money can be redirected to our priorities. And we also need to untether South Africans from failed state-owned entities. We need to have an honest conversation as a country whether we can really afford to be bailing out entities like Denel and SAA in the amount of over 40 billion rand in the last few years, when we have people living in sewage as a result of an inability to address an infrastructure crisis of that quantity. The next step has to be about facilitating private sector investment in public infrastructure. It must be known that government does not have the resources alone to address this problem, but that the private sector has every interest in these issues being addressed to ensure that they can conduct business efficiently in South Africa. And that is why we say we need to reform the legislation around public-private partnerships and make them easier and make them quicker to facilitate, and to ensure that government can take advantage of the balance sheets of the private sector, and the private sector can recoup those investments over the long term. This is how we can address our infrastructure quickly without having to deal with an economy and without a fiscus is unable to deal with it alone from a public sector point of view. We also believe that there has to be an amendment to the Protection of Investment Act of 2015 to remove the barriers in place that stop international investment in our public infrastructure. We need every resource available to address this challenge, and we need to make the work of investors easier so that we can address the problems in South Africa. The third priority is the reform of the procurement system. We need to make the process transparent. We need to end the eras of tenderpreneurship, and we need to make sure that South Africans can publicly observe how these processes are run, because ultimately the best disinfectant is always sunlight. But we must consider only experienced and proven bidders for major infrastructure projects. I have seen too many infrastructure projects in my travels around South Africa that are being done for the 3rd or the 4th time because the companies that got it before didn't have the experience, didn't have the knowledge, and didn't have the resources to do it properly. We don't have the resources to fix things 4 times. We should only have to fix it once. And we need to adopt the principle that the best bids get the work. Ultimately, we need to make sure that there's value for money. We need to make sure that roads that are built stand the test of time, and we need to make sure that South Africans get value for the public procurement through our tender system. The fourth priority is the protection of our infrastructure. South Africa is losing billions and billions of rands of infrastructure to theft and damage, and to criminal syndicates who profit from the collapse of, for example, our rail network. In that regard, we would like to bring legislation that adopts national key points for all strategic parts of our infrastructure network. Ultimately, that kind of national key point is one that all South Africans can get behind before we start declaring things like Lutuli House to be a national key point. We also believe that there has to be the passage of a Criminal Law Amendment Act to ensure that a crime of economic sabotage is established in our legislation, which carries with it a mandatory life sentence. And you know, under ActionSA, life means life. For any form of damage, theft, or importantly, corruption in the procurement process relating to our economic infrastructure. In addition to this, there has to be a specialized infrastructure protection unit, which must be established under the command of the SAPS. The SANDF must provide capacity, because the role of a modern military in South Africa undoubtedly must be to protect our national interests in the form of infrastructure. And it must provide a cradle-to-grave facility, a cradle-to-grave function of intelligence gathering against often organized crime interests that are behind this theft and vandalism, behind infrastructure protection, but also in the investigation and seeing cases through prosecution for damage and theft and corruption as it relates to our infrastructure network. There has to be a national infrastructure planning unit that oversees the infrastructure master plan, its design, and its implementation. It needs to be capacitated with competent people, engineers, project managers, and financial managers. Those are the skills that are required for infrastructure to succeed. And importantly, it needs to have a transversal management function. It needs to combine human resources and knowledge sets across the different government departments so that they don't work in silos. It needs to be multi-departmental in nature, but it also needs to bring in national and provincial and local government, often where the greatest culprits of infrastructure failure lie. The sixth priority is addressing the skills and capacitation in government. ActionSA has committed that a skills audit will need to be conducted on day one of entering government, because we need to know who is there because of what they know and not who they know, so we can get rid of those people who are there on the basis of their party membership card, and that goes for any political party. We need people who know what they're doing in government. We need to have an organizational culture of appointing the best person for the job, so that ultimately the best work is done to the benefit of all South African people. There needs to be a rationalization of the civil service, so that it is not an employment agency of the ANC, but actually we have a lean and mean civil service, but critically we have the right skills in the right departments to oversee these kind of projects. And there has to be a focus on those critical skills of engineers, project and financial managers to ensure that these capital projects are completed on time and within budget and to an acceptable standard for the South African people. The seventh priority is reforming cooperative government. We need a vertical integration of the infrastructure management function from national to provincial and to local government. If we are honest with ourselves, the greatest culprits in our infrastructure failures are often local government, and yet nothing is being done about it. We need to have minimum requirements that national government places on every municipal budget in terms of the renewal, repairs and maintenance of infrastructure, and it has to be monitored over time in such a manner that municipalities have no option but to implement those budgets and to do so at an acceptable standard and return on investment. And there needs to be oversight over that process to ensure that value for money is being obtained throughout the infrastructure value chain, nationally, all the way down to the local level. And that's where we end with the final priority. We need to end the buddy-buddy relationship between local and provincial government that persists, typically when they are both governed by the same political party. There needs to be harsh measures adopted against the delinquency of local government that is increasing, with municipalities like eThekwini for example, like Buffalo City, and like an increasingly long list of places where residents are living with the consequences daily of infrastructure failure that infringe on the constitutionally enshrined rights to live in safe environments, to have safe drinking water, and to have a good supply of basic services. We need to ensure that those municipalities are placed under the harshest kinds of administration, that competent and skilled administrators are put in place, and that a budget is availed to those administrators to ensure we don't have municipalities under administration in perpetuity because they are bankrupt, like we see in places like Msunduzi in KZN or Mfuleni in Gauteng, so that they actually can turn around and deliver the services that they were intended to under our Constitution. But the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that the failure of infrastructure is increasingly touching the lives of more and more South Africans. I have travelled the country and I've sat with people in the south coast of KZN who have not had a drop of water in 9 years. I've sat with communities impacted by the Giyani Water Project who continue to live without water in their daily lives. We have dealt with communities that have to deal with the road networks that is destroying their vehicles and increasing the cost of business and ultimately the cost to consumers. We have sat with communities where water and sewerage and electricity issues are daily a part of their lives. And the truth is, this is becoming one of the biggest issues in South Africa. What is which cannot be understood in the lives of South Africans is that political parties are silent about this issue in this election. ActionSA wants to end that silence. We want to present this infrastructure master plan to the South African people to say to them that we have a plan that we will implement in government. We will make this plan central to any government of which we find ourselves a part and a non-negotiable part of any negotiation to ensure that the South African people get the world-class infrastructure they deserve. And ultimately, we stand before South Africans to say that despite the challenges they face, there is hope. We can fix South Africa. We can have world-class infrastructure. They can get the basic services that the Constitution promised them in 1996. But we need a change of government. And we need their help on the 29th of May to put the ANC in the opposition benches so that the work to fix South Africa and our infrastructure can begin.